Let's pray. Amazing and gracious God, for every blessing we give you thanks. We thank you for the blessing of this day and for the opportunity to hear Dr. Hooker speak about very important matters of life and of community, of racism. We pray for a movement towards a greater shalom experience with more justice and wholeness. We pray for that increased experience of beloved community, and we pray that we will join with you, Lord, and with one another in moving in the direction that we need to go. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, well, good afternoon. I'm Karan Alexander, and I'm the co-facilitator of the Pro-Reconciliation Anti-Racism Team for Illinois, Wisconsin region. And on behalf of the PRAR team, I want to thank everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us this afternoon and to be part of the discussion about transforming the narrative for healing and wholeness in our world. Now, most of you would probably agree that this is a daunting task, even in the best of times. And the team wanted to bring in a speaker that could speak to what we are experiencing in our world today. So that meant someone, we thought, with knowledge of international issues, community capacity building, minority justice, mental health concerns, gender equity, and restorative justice platforms. And even the knowledge that how we are living is connected to our brothers and sisters in other countries. Now, luckily we didn't have to look very far, because right over in the next state was someone who qualifies on all these levels. Plus, he's an educator, he currently serves as the associate professor of listen to this, the practice of conflict transformation and peace building at the University of Notre Dame, the Joan B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. He's also an author. He's written the book, The Little Book of Transformative Community Conferencing, and he's an ordained clergy in the United Church of Christ. So if you haven't already done so, you can read more about his professional accomplishments that came with your registration information. But I like to tell a little something personal about people. So I had to ask Reverend, say, look, can I have something personal? So he was born in Cincinnati, and he was the third of 5 children. So that makes him, what, the middle child? Okay. And although he was born in the Midwest, he spent every summer in Moultrie, Georgia, which is where his parents were from. He's been invited to be keynote speaker for various domestic and international organizations. He's presented workshops in the areas of public policy, racial issues, minority mental health, and social identity construction in post-conflict context. He works with the Southern Poverty Law Center and serves as the dissertation advisor for doctoral students there at Notre Dame. But with all of this, and he's pretty heavy, he insists that he received his most important training for what he does from his experiences as an understudy in community theater and from his love of participating in urban partner dances. Now, some of us might know what that is, and then some of us might not, but I'll let him tell you more about it if he chooses. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker and presenter for today, the Reverend Dr. David Anderson Hooker.
Thank you. Thank you. So I usually try to figure out when I'm starting, like what I'm going to talk about or say, not what I'm going to talk about exactly. I've got some idea of that, but kind of where do we begin? And I realized this morning, I don't know for any of you what the temperature is. I know we're all in various different places, but in South Bend, I'm in South Bend, Indiana right now, and the temperature dropped about about 40 degrees in the last 2 days. And my body still hasn't adjusted. Some of you, if you find older pictures of me, not too much older, but previous pictures of me, you'll know that I had 14 years worth of hair on my head. My hair was locked for a long time before I shaved it. And I've lost a little weight and I've gotten in slightly better shape, but my body, body temperature doesn't adjust well to these rapid changes. And so I still, like, I see me in a jacket, I see some of you in your t-shirts and short shirts, Evan is sitting outside in this beautiful weather and this kind of thing. And my body hasn't adjusted to the rapid change in temperature. And I actually think that in many ways, that reflects what's happening right now in the United States and in other parts of the world where the body politic hasn't adjusted to the rapid change in demand for a new kind of energy, a new inclusion. These, kind of the uprisings, the protests, even as far back as Occupy and before that in many parts of the world, there's some a different energy. And many body politics, especially including ours, have not adjusted. And one of the body politics that has not adjusted well at all to this changing dynamic is the church. And so to the extent that we get a chance to talk about that, I'd love to talk with you a bit more about that. But what I wanted to do was talk, and I was telling Karan that I've got probably, the invitation had a mistake on it. We're supposed to go from 1 to 3, and the invitation may have said 1 to 4. I have 3 hours worth of conversation for you, but we really don't have that much time. And so we're going to get as far as we can get and still hopefully have enough time for questions, answers, questions, wrestling, and a bit of your own personal discussion. So let me just jump right in. If I'm going too fast, somebody can signal in the participants responses that I should go slower, and somebody will let me know that I should go slower. But the conversation for today, just somewhat formal, but I'd like it to be even a more informal, is God's Shalom. Justice and wholeness in today's world and transforming the narrative for healing and wholeness. So the idea is to begin with a question. The flow of the discussion is we'll start with a question, talk really quickly. This group will understand the relationship between justice and shalom, so I won't spend a lot of time there, but then I want to spend the most time talking about the process of transforming historical harm, or at least we'll get to the part of understanding what historical harms are and talk a bit about how they're transformed and what the heavy role of narrative is in transforming these historical harms. And then I want to come back to your questions and want to create some space for you to have some small group conversation about that. And then we'll come back together and we'll harvest all of that. So we may have, depending on how efficiently I can get through the material, we may have 15 or 20 minutes or so before we go into small group. Then we'll go out in the small group, we'll come back and we'll harvest that material. If during the course of the conversation you have a clarifying question, like you just really don't understand something that I said, let's figure out a way, put that in the chat. One of the co-hosts will notice it as a clarifying question. Put in the chat clearly, this is a clarifying question, like I just don't understand this concept or something like that, so I can spend time making sure we get it. If it's either I don't agree with it or I'm trying to figure out how that works, I want to expand on it a bit, raise those questions, but let's save them to see how efficiently we can get through the material. All right? Cool. So this is the question. This is where we begin. In what ways does God's shalom contribute to the transformation of historical harms? That's kind of, we're keeping that as our background to figure out how this actually works at all. What most of you know is this piece, shalom, peace. And the kind of peace that's talked about scripturally, biblically, you know, in our theologies is different from kind of the primary Western definition of peace, which is most about absence of violence. And the peace that we're talking about is a peace that's founded on justice. It's not just an individual achievement, but it's a collective experience of right relationships. We talk about that as righteousness, that full flourishing, full recompense for past and present wrongdoing. All of that is part of the shalom as it is referenced scripturally. So peace is founded in justice. And without saying, so you know that peace and justice are two of the most highly discussed concepts in all of Scripture. So there's all kinds of places where the prophets, where the Proverbs, where the Psalms, where the Gospels, where the epistles, there's always a commentary about justice. Because Jesus's primary mission was to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovering the sight of the blind, setting at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. But proclaim is one of those words that we have lost the significance of in our modern lexicon. We think proclamation is something that you say, whereas in its original context, proclamation was actually something that you do. I'd rather see a sermon lived every day. Proclamation is something that you do. How do you bring about liberty to the captive and liberty to those who are oppressed? And when that justice happens, there is a direct connection that justice happens, and the effect of justice and right relationships, righteousness as right relations, is the effect of that is peace. And so you can build trust, you can have the kind of quietude, not silence, but the kind of quietude that allows a sense of certainty, assurance for a good life moving forward when justice is dwelling in all parts of the land. Justice and shalom, it's there. So the question is, the background question is, how does this shalom contribute to, or how might it contribute to the transformation of historical harms? So, but this question about justice is the first challenge that we have is, what is this justice, right? I have an article, I co-authored an article in a journal, came out, I guess earlier this year. The title of the article is "Justice is Neither Boat Nor Barbecue," which is a kind of a me being silly and playful, whatever. But justice is neither boat nor barbecue. Why do I say that? If I say boat without even seeing these pictures, if I say boat, there is an essential aspect of what is conjured in your mind, some kind of a vessel. It can be a small punt that would be going along the Thames River. It could be a sailboat. It could be a yacht. But a boat has an essential characteristic. It's a vessel that's constructed in a way to carry people or cargo across whatever the conditions are that it is likely to meet, to respond above water to the conditions that it's likely to meet. And so there's an essence to boatness. Is there an essence to justice? If I say justice to two or more people, to three or more people, conjure the same idea in their mind. Not sure. My sense is that we don't, that there's not an essence to boatness. There's also, I say justice is neither boat nor barbecue. Barbecue is slightly different. In this sense, barbecue is like this. It's not clear, and this picture captures all three of the ways that we think about barbecue. Is barbecue the product? Is it the thing that comes off of the grill? Is barbecue the process? Is it grilling itself, or is barbecue the space that people come to? I'm going to a barbecue, people are going to barbecue, and the product will be barbecue. Sometimes when people talk about justice, they talk about justice as process, as product. Justice was served in this instance, no justice was done, or there's no justice here, there's no space for justice. And so it's not clear, without it there being an essence to justice, that justice, when you just saying it, helps us. And so just because we know that shalom, peace founded in justice, is necessary or is desired, if we don't know what justice is, then how do we know what is desired? So this leads to what I call a PETERSON problem. We have this notion in peace building. I'm a professor of conflict transformation and peace building. In peace building, we say peace is not the absence of violence, but the presence of justice. But if we don't know, and so there's no justice, no peace, but peace requires justice. But if we don't know what the justice is, then that produces what we call a PETERSON problem. This is a PETERSON problem. I grew up in Cincinnati. I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. And often drove to Cleveland. Driving from Cincinnati to Cleveland, sometimes if you don't take the main highways, you go on the back roads, you pass through Elyria, Ohio. This is a snapshot of downtown Elyria, right? And so in Elyria, there is a shop. If you get off of State Route 57 or 301 in the River Street overpass, there's what's called the River Street overpass. There is a small shop, and it's Mr. Peterson's. Mr. Peterson has a very unique shop. He has a veterinary and a taxidermy shop. So Peterson's Veterinary and Taxidermy. And there's a beautiful picture of a golden retriever in the seal on the front window. And it says Peterson's Veterinary and Taxidermy. Either way, you get your dog back. So we have a PETERSON problem because we don't have a sense of what justice is, and we don't have a sense of peace without justice. And so if we don't have peace without justice, and we don't have justice without peace, we can't figure out what it is we need to do to get to either one. So how do we get to peace? Woe unto you who knew the time of my visitation, if you only knew what it took to make peace. This is Jesus's woes on his way into Jerusalem at the end of his ministry. You know, and what does God require of you? That you do justice, that we do justice. So if we don't know what justice is, we don't know what peace, we have to have some kind of a framework for how to deal with justice and peace. And the framework that I think through is that both justice and peace are impeded by the presence, the unaddressed historical harms. And so we have to look at transforming historical harms as our pathway to justice and peace. So let's talk a bit about what are historical harms. This is a complex thing. It's not a mathematical formula. It looks like it could be almost reduced to a mathematical formula. It's not. I'm giving it to you up front, and then I'm going to go back and break down each of these pieces, but I want you to see the whole thing up front to see what we're building on. This is the idea. There are traumagenic events and traumagenic contexts. I'll explain what traumagenic is, how I distinguish traumagenic from trauma. But there are historically traumagenic events and context that contribute to our creation of knowledge, what we know and don't know. That knowledge creation gets embedded in the history, the folklore, the mythology, the lies that we tell, which I call legacy, and the structures and systems, which I talk about as aftermath. And then there's constantly resistance to it. And so all of that is the ongoing process of distributing social power and producing our identities. And then we perform our identities, and we perform those identities, and those identities are shaped and refined by the social systems that we engage in, including the church. And all of those, the power dynamics contribute, they create advantage for some and disadvantage for others. And over time, those advantages and disadvantages have the effect of compounding. They grow, the disadvantages increases, the advantages decrease, or the advantages increase, the disadvantages increase. So you have this compounding sense of advantage and disadvantage depending on who gets it. And so this is what we're trying to transform, is the present day historical harms. You can't change the history. You have to be aware of the history to understand how it's built into our narratives and into our systems and structures, and why there's a need for resistance. But then we have to undo the compounding. And so that's undoing the historical harms. That's transforming historical harms. That's what I want to talk about. If I'm going too fast, somebody let me know. But I want to talk about some terms that become really important for our conversation. And I want to go through these really quickly. Traumagenic, legacy, aftermath, historical harms, and I have this 4-part inquiry on transforming historical harms, but truth is we probably won't get a chance to look at it, or if we do, we'll look at it in a very peripheral way today. We're going to get primarily to the point of understanding what the historical harms are, or how they're being produced and reproduced. And then I'm going to invite you all to go into small groups to talk about what you're seeing for yourselves so far once we've talked about that. Most people think they have an understanding of trauma, and most of us have an understanding of trauma that I think is actually a bit misplaced. We think of trauma as an event. People went through trauma, or people, the circumstance was trauma. And that's probably not exactly right. Trauma is actually the response, the reaction or the response when you're being overwhelmed, when you're experiencing overwhelm, when your life is threatened, or when your community capacities are threatened and there's a sense of overwhelm. There are typically these 3 responses: fight, flight, freeze. And if the energy that's created and the immobilization that's created, if you fight, if you flee, and you successfully fight or flee, then typically there's not a sense of trauma. There's not an unaddressed sense of trauma. It's when you're frozen, and then that frozenness goes unhealed or unresolved. It has lasting biological, emotional, behavioral, spiritual, and societal consequences. So the trauma itself, and this is a distinction I really want to make, the trauma itself is the reaction, it's the response, not the event, not the conditions. So when I say traumagenic, genus is like the genesis, the beginning, the source of something. And so an event or circumstance or cumulative set of conditions can produce trauma. The reaction can be trauma. The trauma is the response, it's not the event. The event itself may be overwhelming to some. It may be overwhelming to some communities where other communities have the resources necessary to build. I think about this every time a storm comes into New Orleans, where in the first ward, the third ward, people were fine. They weren't overwhelmed by it. The ninth ward, the lower ninth ward particularly, the conditions were overwhelming based on the resources that they had available. And so it was the genesis, it was the support, what was produced was collective and individual trauma. But not everybody was overwhelmed by it. Not everybody experienced trauma just because the events were there, right? So I make that distinction. And then historical trauma, I'm talking about massive trauma, trauma circumstances, traumagenic circumstances that happen and are directed at groups of people. So it's more specific to particular groups of people, and then gets passed generationally. So one indigenous scholar, Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, talks about it as the collective emotional and psychological injury that span over and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma and perpetuating massive group trauma across generations. And so this is the important thing, is one of the important things is that you don't have to have experienced the traumagenic events, conditions to receive and still perform the massive group trauma that gets transmitted from generation to generation. And how does that happen? How does the trauma get passed from generation to generation? It's built in. So there is some sense that there may be something biological, but it's also built in to what I call legacy and aftermath. So legacy is like the things that get passed down. Think about legacy as things that get handed to you, that get bequeathed to you, like a will almost, or a trust. The beliefs, the mythology, the prejudices, the biases that get passed down from one group to another. And then aftermath is the structures. Like if you think about after a storm, there's all this rubble. What are the structures that perpetuate this trauma? Laws, policies, economic practices, and it gets built into all of our society's supporting systems, especially education system, religion, social services, the so-called criminal justice system. All of those, the structures reinforce the legacy, and so they work together. So the aftermath, the structures are reinforcing the legacy, and they're shaped by the legacy. So this is just an example. This is a narrative. This, the legacy, the story, the mythology, the folklore, the lies that have been told are that everything about Europe, Europeans are civilized and good, and as a result, what's non-civilized and non-European is not good. So then that legacy comes with a value proposition. The value proposition is that what is good should be expanded for the good of all. This is good for everybody. And what is not good should be contained, transformed, or extinguished for the good of all, which is how the missionaries related when they dealt with indigenous and non-European nations, nationalities, so that we used the notion of goodness as the justification for colonialism, for eradication, for dispossession, because it was for the good of all. Legacy and aftermath. And so the idea is you have to know both and then work on dismantling the two at the same time. If you only stop telling the stories, but you leave the structures in place, the structures will reproduce the story. People will start making meaning that sounds like the old story. If you change the structures, but you still tell the old story, then we'll build new structures to support the old story that we're telling. I hope you guys are still with me, right? So aftermath, the laws, the structure, the policies, the systems, the policy of forced removal of indigenous people, the structures, the establishment of the residential schools in US, Canada, and Australia that then, so they took indigenous children, and because everything non-European was not good, they would kidnap European children, put them in these boarding schools, and try to civilize them by teaching them to not be indigenous. Don't do your laws, don't practice your rituals, relinquish your religion, get rid of your name, don't practice your language, and then eventually when you're an adult, we'll put you back into society as a civilized person. So that's what they did to indigenous people. Similarly, there were laws and structures and policies for Jim Crow, for the apartheid that happened in both South Africa and the Southern United States, and colonial practices. And so you can see the narrative that supports the structures and how the two coincide so that one gives meaning making to the other. So I'm going to go through these really quickly. I usually like to spend a lot of time on my assertions, but I'm going to run through them quickly. You can test them with me at the end, but I want to make sure that we're at a good place to have plenty of time for conversation. So, oh goodness. We are not going to have time, are we? We'll have enough time, yeah. Identities are processes. It's not like you are born with an identity. Your identity gets shaped and it gets impacted throughout your life, both by historical context and also by the historical factors, such as the way that you are related to and addressed by socializing institutions, structures, systems, relationship patterns. All of that shapes your identity. These systems and structures that we have, none of them are natural. The laws that we have are not laws of nature. The institutions that we have, education, the curriculum, the criminal justice system, the medical system, none of that is natural. All of it arises out of the product of imagination and social agreements that have taken place over time. And many of those imaginations are shaped and formed in response to traumagenic institutions, to traumagenic circumstances. And so the structures, the institutions, relational patterns have all been shaped in response to traumagenic circumstances. What we know is that when people have been hurt, they hurt other people. And the systems and structures that arise out of traumagenic circumstances tend to provide advantages for some and disadvantage for others based on some assigned, assumed, or perceived identities: gender, race, indigeneity, ethnicity, nationality, some assigned or assumed or perceived identities. Your advantages and disadvantages are distributed based on traumagenic, the systems and structures that emerge from traumagenic circumstances and traumagenic imagination. And those advantages and disadvantages compound over time. So then this is the thing, the systems are shaped by, and then they conform to societal narratives. You can never change a system by understanding the system. You can't change the church by understanding the administrative structure of the church. You can't change a university by understanding the administrative structure of the university. You have to understand the societal narratives within which that institution exists, within which that system is flourishing. And then we do believe, this is an assertion that I make, is that those systems, institutions, structures, relational patterns can be transformed, and we believe that people individually and collectively can heal. So those are the assertions. I delve more deeply into each of these in these two texts, the Transforming Historical Harms Manual and the Transformative Community Conferencing, begin talking about each of them. And there are a number of other articles and other places where I write and delve more deeply into all of that. But for now, go back to where we started. These are historical harms. Historically traumagenic events and traumagenic contexts are responsible for knowledge creation. That knowledge then gets built into our systems and structures and gets embedded in the stories, the history, the folklore, the mythology, the lies that we tell, and the resistance to it. Right now in our world, right at this very moment, you can see this playing out with the legacy, the aftermath, the folklore, the lies, all trying to combine, and the resistance to it in this notion where in the New York Times had this 1619 project where Nicole Hannah-Jones and others wrote about the present day compounding impacts and enduring legacy of the histories and institutions of enslavement, and that being taught. And so it's causing some resistance and it's causing change and challenge to some of that legacy. And so in response to the resistance, the current federal administration is interested in creating what they call the 1776 Project, which is to reinforce the systematic superiority of whiteness as the basis for the founding and the superiority of the country. And so there's resistance as there's a demand for the legacy and aftermath to change. And the 1619 Project is one way of beginning to address the compounding advantages and disadvantages, and there's always going to be resistance to it. James Baldwin, one of the people I love to listen to, go back and read and reread. What makes this transforming historical harms difficult? James Baldwin says, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once the hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with the pain. Remember, one of the assertions was that hurt people hurt people. And so people who have been oppressed find their way to a new country. They go out, they seek out this new land. They say it's a land of freedom and opportunity. And then in the process of pursuing their own freedom and opportunity, they replicate the kind of oppression, the dispossession, the destruction of religious practices. Even though many of them fled religious persecution, they came here to reproduce religious persecution. They fled places where their cultures were being denigrated to come here to denigrate other cultures. They fled a feudal system where their labor was being exploited, and they came here and created exploitive labor and entire systems and laws and cultures and institutions and a knowledge base based on the replication of all of the oppressions that they had. Many people understand when they've been oppressed, but they don't understand or fail to acknowledge when they are being oppressor. And if we have to deal with it, and so often that pain gets buried in hate. And so when we start transforming historical harms, the first response is often going to be a hateful response. But when we're addressing it, we have to know that what we're dealing with isn't a hateful response, but a painful response. Just like when a dog or a cat is in pain and you try to touch the place that's painful in them, they will snap at you, they will bite at you because they are responding to pain, but it looks like hate and violence. I think James Baldwin is on to something. So how does it get passed on? What is the legacy? What's the aftermath? What's this structure? So we often say that what we have to do when we're trying to engage with others is we have to listen to their stories. And stories are interesting. I focus a lot on stories in my mediation work, in my restorative justice work, but I'm not listening to the stories. I'm listening to the narratives and the master narratives that shape their stories. And I make this distinction because it's an important distinction. It's a powerful distinction. A change in stories will not change people's lives. A change in narrative will change the structures that change people's lives. So if we're transforming historical harms, we have to be about the process of changing narratives and master narratives. Quick examples, and then we'll get out, and I'll give you an opportunity to talk. A story is just, it's a particular sequence of events. We tell a story. Generally, it has a past, present, future kind of arc, you know. Stories, you can tell there's a different kind of way that stories are told. Some of them are clearly fairy tales or fiction, but it's hard to know these days when they're different. Sometimes people tell fiction and fairy tales as though it's news. But a narrative is a coherent system that creates the space, the container in which stories can be understood. So if I told you, if somebody lived in a victim's narrative, right? If they lived inside of a victim narrative, then the story that they're going to tell is going to pick out the data that follows the trajectory, the basic trajectory of a victim's narrative. We have some of these narratives pass over time, they become transhistorical. They cross time boundaries, they cross generational boundaries, they become deeply embedded in our particular culture, and so they become like master narratives. The master narratives are the thing that get transferred in scripture, in storybooks. So Jonah is a master narrative. People know the Jonah story. People know the prodigal son. And so you can identify others who are acting in prodigal ways. You know the little engine that could, you know the boy that cried wolf or Chicken Little. Those are master narratives. And so then when people are telling a story, it fits inside of one of those master narratives. This is the difference between narrative and story. Any story that you tell is connected in some way. Narratives has the capacity to connect a variety of different individual stories. And then, if we had more time, we would talk about the way that ideology and hegemony force stories to be understood a particular way, force narratives to be transmitted in a particular way, and make certain stories more understandable and more believable than others. I want to talk about one narrative that was particularly interesting that came up recently. It's an old trope. It's a narrative about the fact that people of African descent aren't trustworthy. That's just a narrative. That's just a narrative. That's legacy. Then what's the aftermath? The aftermath, what are the structural components that reinforce that? It gets structurally reinforced through real estate laws, through banking laws, through the way that we finance our schools, through the way that we insure business, through the way that we do or don't extend credit, through the way that we place healthcare systems and we deny transportation, public transportation. And then all of that kind of plays on itself, so it reinforces itself, so that the aftermath, the structures reproduce the story and they make the story make sense. And so when people are doing something that goes against that ideology, it almost feels violent. So if somebody says something as seemingly insignificant to some as Black Lives Matter, because that absolutely contradicts a primary ideology or hegemony that has been dominant for a long time, it feels like a violent effort to disrupt the discourse. It feels like a violent, almost nonsensical way of relating to the world. And we would want people to stop saying things like that because they don't make much sense. And what we have to do, what Black Lives Matter is trying to do, what Occupy was trying to do, what other social movements have tried to do over time, is to create counter narratives and then to create a habit, because the habit is just how we live. We each live inside of stories, and our performance The way that we make meaning, the way that we act from day to day, from moment to moment, is just about habits in which story we're choosing to live in. So if we're choosing to change the discourse and the structures and to transform historical harms, we have to do that by creating a habituation of counter narratives. One of the places where we see this being encouraged was when Jesus would say, "You have heard it said," that's the dominant narrative, that's the hegemony, that's what people say about you, "but I say to you," which is to show up differently. You have heard it said, but I say to you. How do we create practices that actually disrupt the ongoing compounding advantageous and disadvantageous social forces that are built into our modern narratives? That's the work that we're trying to do. Social narratives possess a certain energy, and that energy gets dispersed into all of our social systems. And so it turns out, this is a paraphrase of a James Baldwin. He says, if you're treated a certain way, you become a certain kind of person. If certain things are described to you as being real, they become real for you, whether they're real or not, which is for all of us. The way that we have been racialized, the way that we have been engendered, the way that we have been embedded so that our relationship to faith and theology is so deeply woven with white supremacy that we can't recognize it. So when people try to introduce African and South American liberation theology, we call it heretical because it is so antithetical to the superiority, the colonial mentality that has just been a natural part of the way that we think theologically. And so how do we construct new counter narratives that would infuse every aspect of our social ecology? The question is, in what ways does, or in what ways might God's shalom contribute to the transforming of historical harms? And then the secondary question for that would be, if it contributes, if there's a way that it might contribute to the transformation of historical harms, is bringing about God's shalom God's work or ours? Oh, it's 2:00. I do want to have about 10 minutes in group. Then I'm going to send folks off into breakout rooms to deal with that, and we'll come back and we'll have a little time for harvesting. But I don't want to just send you off. If there are questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, anything that people want to raise while we're here, that would be good. Did any of it make sense? Does it seem like it's, yeah? Okay. I'd love to hear from you.
If we're going to address the questions in our breakout groups, though, I'm going to need those again.
I think that we can share those with you in the breakout group, Amy. I was asked a question. Are you familiar with Resmaa Menakem and My Grandmother's Hands and the body work and healing work he's talking about doing?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I am familiar with it. I think it's really important work. And so when I think about like a nested, the way that trauma sits in your body, it's all the way from the micronutrients all the way to the meta narratives. And so if we're doing healing, we've got to be doing it and aligning at every level, from the most microcosmic way through our personal, relational. So I talk a lot about fractal practice as a way of healing. And, you know, at some point I may get into that, but absolutely. Questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, anything particularly that people either thought, this doesn't work, this doesn't fly, or something like that, that would be helpful too.
I had a question, and I'm still trying to kind of frame it without having the PowerPoints in front of me. But so you said we needed to change both structure and stories, but then we focused on the counter narratives.
Right.
I was just kind of wondering a little bit about, do we start with stories, or I don't know. I was just kind of wondering if I was understanding what you were saying correctly, or if you could tell a little bit more about both stories and structure. And what that was.
So not stories as much as narratives,
Yeah,
which is the
sorry.
first thing, right?
Sure.
So systems exist in affirmation of narratives, dominant narratives, right? And so we produce, so if the law or the rule or the institution doesn't make sense inside of the narrative, then it starts to fall apart on its own, right? So we have to look for the ways that certain narratives reinforce certain structures, and you have to do them both at the same time. So it's not just changing the structure, but it's also changing the structure in alignment with a new narrative. So we have to be building that counter narrative. So it's not working on one first and then the other. It's working on them together at the same time. One of the clearest examples of this for me of changing the structure but not changing the narrative was at the time of emancipation, when African descendants who had been enslaved were being emancipated, the president who signed the emancipation order was clearly of the mindset that Africans were not equal. He says repeatedly, they are not our equal. I am not intending to create a system in which they will become equal to the white man, right? Yeah. I'm emancipating them to preserve the union because of these economic differences between the North and the South that can't coexist in one structure, one federal structure. So the narrative of the inferiority of the Black and the exclusion of Africans didn't change, which made it easy right after emancipation to introduce convict leasing and the slavery, to change the 13th Amendment so that it allowed for enslavement by another name, to allow for Jim Crow and federal government to not resist that, because the narrative was never changed. So a new structure emerged to maintain the distinction and the position of inferiority. You got to change them both at the same time.
So I just want to do a quick follow-up and make sure I understand. So the trouble with creating counter narratives is it's so hard to get people behind it because it goes against what the institutions and the previous narratives. So that's where it's what makes it so hard is that we're sharing a narrative that is not accepted by our institutions, which we follow and before they're changed. So am I understanding that correctly, like the challenge of it?
That's the challenge of it. And one of the things of the ecclesia, do you remember that before it was a church, it was an ecclesia? It was people who were set apart, who chose to go outside of the system to set up new systems. And so instead of working in that kind of feudal system and things like that, they cooperated together. They created a different economic order. They created a different relational set of patterns and practices that changed the gender dynamics, that changed the ethnic and national politics of a place, to show people, to demonstrate that this other way was possible so that people could choose which system to live inside of. And that's the idea, is you don't have to go in. Heresy is important. I need all of us to plan to be heretical, to plan to do heresy, because what heresy does is it changes the system from inside. When you're inside the system, you're using the language of the system to change the system. Martin Luther King was a heretic, right? But you also need people like the Black Panther Party. You need people who set up these communes and things like that to show that there's another model that's also possible, so people can choose with every action they take what to live into, right? And so you're both undoing the system from within, but you're also creating examples from without.
Thank you.
In the world, not of the world, creating an ecclesia, practicing this politic in another space.
So an example in our current society would be Black Lives Matter. Then people who want to contend, I'm not going for all lives matter now, but Blue Lives Matter, because Blue Lives Matter actually represents the more dominant narrative in our society, and the Black Lives Matter a counter narrative in our society.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Dr. Hooker, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this. So using the example of immigrants, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, early in the process of immigration, they were viewed as Black, and
yes,
experienced a lot of discrimination, and then their narrative changed. The story about them changed, and they were integrated into the main narrative, which is built on the myth of white superiority. So you can change a part of the narrative around one group to fit a dominant narrative.
So they were, Irish became white and Italians became white. And so whiteness is a concept, because it's not a biological or a morphological or a genetic or a national kind of proposition. Whiteness expands and contracts depending on, so whiteness is a political condition, Blackness is a political condition, right? And so we get to choose who's Black, who's not Black in certain ways. So before 9/11, on every census that happened before 9/11, Arabs were white. 9/11, we thought we should have a different category to distinguish, because they're not quite, they got booted out in the same way that some people got incorporated in. And one of the primary ways that immigrants were able to get incorporated in was by demonstrating their willingness to fervently pursue anti-Blackness, right? And so when the Irish were willing to fervently pursue anti-Blackness, then they make them the police officers. And so their responsibility is to manage the freedom-seeking behaviors of Africans, right? And so they become the front guard, the vanguard of limiting freedom-seeking behaviors of others. Now you get to be white.
Okay, and so just to further clarify, that I'm understanding the vocabulary. So with the Irish, the traumagenic event would have been their original experience as immigrants. And then when the concept was switched, they act out of that unhealed trauma, hurting because they've been hurt.
Yes, well, yes.
Okay.
They act out of that, that's part of what you see is a cycle of victimhood and violence, where those who were victimized find other opportunities and they produce victims. This is in so many ways, we see a cycle of victimhood and violence in sexual abuse and child abuse and cultural abuse. In so many ways, you see cycles of victimhood and violence where people act in, act out, and then you produce structures to support your acting in and acting out. And you also have to tell stories. This is the thing about most children. Identities are formed. Identities are a process. Children have an innate sense of fairness. And so in order for them to abide by unfair and inequitable systems, you have to teach them a set of beliefs and stories and legacies that give them justification to accept what they otherwise saw as unfair or unequal. And a lot of that gets embedded in the way that we transmit theology, in the way that we do education, in so many other ways, so that they can justify it, so they can accept it, because that's the only way it can get passed down. The inequity, the inequality gets passed down generationally. That's part of the aftermath, this curriculum that are taught in that way. So. Let's.
May I ask one more quick question?
Yeah, and then we'll go jump to breakout groups, because I want to hear how you all process those questions too.
I'm not going to dodge the word racism or anti-racism. However, Is there some advantage to speaking more about trauma in some ways than speaking about racism and anti-racism? And I don't know if you know what I'm trying to ask in that.
I'm not sure. Go ahead.
We're challenged, those of us who want to offer counter narrative, we're challenged to get people to listen at all sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can't even get them to listen, how much can we perpetuate some helpful change? So the language we use sometimes we hope will maybe be more effective conveyance to get people on board to at least maybe listen better. So I wonder if even the language of trauma might be a helpful conveyance. It's not being disingenuous unless we just totally avoid talking honestly about racism and anti-racism. We still have to bring that out.
Mm-hmm.
But I think some ears can hear talking about trauma
Mm-hmm.
and maybe get to talking about racism and anti-racism more than if we start with racism and anti-racism.
So one of the things that's helpful, if you use, so I always start with the proposition that people aren't the problem is the problem, right? People aren't the problem is the problem. If we have trauma as one aspect of a cultural problematic, right? It's not the only thing, but it's one aspect of a cultural problematic, then we can notice how people respond to trauma. What are the systems that were produced in response to that trauma? What are the systems that are produced to prevent that kind of trauma? The isolation that gets presented, the narratives about difference and those kinds of things. And then how does that disproportionately impact some? How does it disproportionately advantage some and disadvantage others? This is the thing for so many people, because this cycle was started in advance of their recognition of it, their entire identity is embedded in the trauma narrative. It actually requires a level of precarity, like a willingness to almost die to yourself, which is why I know that the vast majority of people who attend churches are not Christian, because they are not committed to the notion of the death of identity, which is absolutely essential. There's a neuropsychologist, then I'm going to let you all go. You got me churned up here. There's a neuropsychologist named David Rock, R-O-C-K, and he has this acronym, SCARF, S-C-A-R-F. Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. SCARF. Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. And he does brain scans. David Rock does brain scans. And what he's discovered is that the exact same parts of your brain that light up if you have a gun to your head, a knife to your throat, or you imagine yourself driving over a cliff, are the exact same parts of your brain that light up when your status is diminished. And then the secondary part of that is it's not actual status. You don't have to get poorer. You don't have to actually get demoted. But if somebody who you have built an embedded identity of superiority over, if they get wealthier, if they get promoted so that they're equal to you, that is the same as if the same parts of your brain light up as if you have a gun to your head or a knife to your throat or you're driving off a cliff. Equality produces precarity, and in order for us to undo the inequities that have been set in motion in this system, identities are going to have to die. And at some point, the church has to be a hospice to allow identities of superiority to die so that the way of Christ, so that God's shalom can actually emerge. That's the work. It's not easy work. It wasn't supposed to be easy. I promise you it wasn't planned to be easy. This is the work that we're signed up to. And if people aren't up for it, then you just ought to say, if you're scared, just say so. Otherwise, this is the work we've got to do. Sorry,
Thank you.
Got me kind of wound up on that last piece. So we're supposed to go off. Who's setting up the breakout rooms? Who's doing that?
They're ready to go when you are.
Okay, so you've got breakout rooms, you've got questions. We may have to change we may have to change the timing just a little bit so that we only have 25 minutes.
Well,
Deal with as
understand
much as you can.
we got started 10 minutes late, so we're giving you your 10 minutes and we're about fine now. But the thing is, some people have left, so we might need to reconfigure the breakouts.
I've already done that. I'm down to 2 groups.
Okay.
So 2 groups of 6 for discussion.
Okay.
Okay, perfect.
And
You all
one-
enjoy that, and I'll see you in a bit when you come back.
So 25 minutes, or do you want to go for 30 minutes? Then?
What, 25 minutes or 30 minutes, Doctor?
Yeah, we'll go with 30 minutes. That's fine.
Okay. Okay.
and
Teresa,
they
you
do-
had a question.
They have the questions or they don't have the questions.
The
And can-
facilitators have the
The
questions.
facilitators have
Fabulous.
the questions. Yes.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay. I'll see you guys in 30 minutes. All right, welcome back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This has been really good for me. I'd like to say I'm so new to this that I think I've been living in La La Land, but in the land. You know,
Uh-huh.
I live on the south side of Chicago, middle class.
Really?
So
Where on the south side of Chicago?
I'm at 90th and King Drive, so I'm between 87th and 95th up the street from Chicago State University.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you familiar with the Chicago Torture Justice Center?
Of course not.
Okay. All right. All right. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
writing that down.
Yeah. Why do they need a Chicago Torture Justice Center?
Right.
Because for 20 years, a so-called rogue unit of the Chicago Police Department was torturing confessions,
Commander
getting tortured.
Right.
Right, Burge and his rogue unit. But then after Burge, then you still have Holman Square, and you've got about 6,000 people who were disappeared at different points. Some of them were still tortured. Some of them were, and those have confessions.
Yes.
And
I have
so there's-
my best friend is a police officer, and he worked in that district for a minute. He says, Daff, no one wants to get lost over there. And I mean, I work right up the street. On the west side. So,
Am I right? Did the director of the torture center then go on at a point to Guantanamo Bay?
Well, the way that they learned about
yeah.
the Torture Justice Center was a guy from the Guardian News, or not the Torture Justice Center, but the torture that was happening.
Right.
Was a guy from the Guardian newspaper was writing an article about Guantanamo.
Right.
And was trying to figure out why so many soldiers from Guantanamo were being recruited to the Chicago Police Department.
Right.
What were the lessons and the techniques that they were learning in Guantanamo that were so needed and necessary in Chicago that no matter where they were from in the country, they were coming back to go to work for the Chicago Police Department. And that's what kind of exposed and blew the whole thing open. But
Then I think there was some feeding each direction of each of those systems. Anyway, okay.
Okay.
so I know we don't have a lot of time. I apologize. And it turns out that I actually have a hard stop. Karan and I never quite got this right. And so I kept saying 1 to 3, 1 to 3, and she kept saying 1 to 3, 1 to 3. And because I'm in a different time zone, when I said 1 to 3, I didn't mean what she said when she said 1 to 3.
I told you Central Standard Time. You know we have that.
I know. So I actually, it turns out I have a hard stop right at 4, but I'm wondering, or
Okay.
right at 3.
Okay.
4 for me,
Yeah,
3 for you.
3 for us.
Um,
Okay.
What, if anything, did you learn in those conversations that was helpful? Or insights, challenges? What emerged from either of your rooms?
I think the most energy in our room came when we were discussing the questions on the second slide, which had to do around the narrative and the story of the disciples.
Mhm.
and the understanding that we have a very mixed history when it comes to definitions of inclusion and humanity and theological views of black versus white. And so there's a lot of education that's needed, and there's a lot of how do we celebrate and build on those while we at the same time repent and heal from the traumas and the traumatic moments.
So I should just say, this is a narrative question. This is a narrative issue which has a direct relationship to structures and systems. When the narrative work is designed around inclusion, that is an effort to undo the othering, not an effort to undo the system. The system produced it. The idea is, how do we incorporate folks into a system without having to drastically undo the system that created the marginalization in the first place?
Sure. Could you say that again? That was fantastic. And I was following. I got about halfway through.
So it's recorded. So it's recorded.
Okay.
Yeah, which is helpful.
Right.
Not comprehending either, but
It was similar. One of the things that came out in our group, I know also from the second question, was on the history and the background of Eureka College being founded by abolitionists. Thank you. And how that's kind of a prideful point to the college to hold on to that. Yet at the same time, they also recognize, or at least Bruce was pointing out, how they are in an area from someone's indigenous land, of all those Native Americans at that time that lived there, no longer live there. No one lived there. And I find it interesting. I didn't get a chance to point this out in the group, but I'm running into more and more groups of people that recognize this is the land we're on from originally, was whatever tribe held this land. And they're starting to change that narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's always part of, if we can claim one part of our justice work, then that hopefully creates a shadow so that you don't see the places of injustice that we were doing in the same moment. And it's not to diminish the justice related work, but it's to say that there's actually more work. You don't necessarily get a pass from one injustice because of one place where you were trying to do better, right?
Right.
So that becomes really important.
Right.
I don't know if everyone got to question number 4, particularly the second one, but if not, because I know a hard 4, so here we go. I was just wondering if anyone did, and if they cared to share that. Did anyone get to question 4, the second one?
About the 5 actions we can take to make sure that nothing changes.
Right.
Yes.
We didn't get to it.
Okay, I didn't think anyone did, but we can say.
Say it again. Say it again. What's the question?
What are 5 actions we can take to make sure that nothing changes?
Of course, that would be 1, not listening.
not being willing to do the hard work of deconstruction and reconstructing the meta-narrative.
So that's what you would not do. What would you do? What are some things that you could do to make sure that nothing changes?
Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, because you say nothing changes. Maybe you could kind of clarify what you mean by that, because that sounds like stopping where we're at instead of being able to move forward.
Well, what I want to notice is that there are things that you can do and you can continue doing so that nothing will change. That's exactly what I want you to make a list of, because if you make a list of 5 to 20 things that you could do, knowing that if we do these things, nothing will change, then you have them in front of you. And then you could just get to say, oh, we're committed to not changing.
Yeah.
These are things that we know we can do if we want nothing to change.
We can continue to live out of our autonomy as if our own little world is the only thing that matters.
Well, but understand, what's the narrative that goes with autonomy? Or what's
It's a big deal for disciples. We love being, that's one of the first things we say about ourselves. We're autonomous.
right?
And
right.
I've reached the point where I say, we don't need to practice that anymore. We've got that down. We need to practice, what does it mean to be in community with one another and to be, anyway.
And what does that allow, though? What are the autonomy allows certain kinds of things, which includes the shutting off of, if there's a national kind of a denomination-wide movement towards something else, there's a way in which the autonomous nature, the structure, the aftermath allows you to reject any other kinds of incursion, infiltration, you know, of ideas even, of ideas or people. Autonomy allows that. And so be autonomous. It is really, really helpful to maintaining the level of inequity in the system. And it gets to model to the rest of the world that in God's name, we can set ourselves apart in ways that we don't have to make changes, and we don't have to include others. We don't have to reconstruct in ways that organize so that others experience coming to the table equally. It's a paradox to suggest that you are autonomous and that your commitment is to the table.
Yes.
The table makes autonomy hypocrisy. And to be able to say, to claim those two in the same breath is just bizarre. You are not committed to the covenant of the table, because a properly set communion table requires that everybody be able, there's no head, there's no tail, that everybody be able to come, that everybody has fundamentally equal access, that they can bring all of their gifts, and that they can be nurtured in everything that they need, and that there's always an open table, an open seat, and an open door. When you set a proper table, there's an open seat and an open door, so whoever the next person is that comes in, they know that they are welcome and that they were prepared for. And to suggest that autonomy aligns with the covenant of the table is hypocrisy.
Autonomy.
So another thing to shut down progress and anti-racism, if I'm understanding, we're talking domination system playbook in a way, would be to treat counter narratives like they're all lies.
They are indeed.
Well, and I think another thing that is prevalent in a lot of our churches is a modern day Gnosticism, where we make it about spirituality and we deny that this is an embodied faith. The incarnation is embodied. And therefore, when we make it all spiritual, we can deny and we can ignore poverty. We can deny violence against other human bodies. We can damn LGBTQ people. And we say it's because it's about the soul.
And you can overlook the fact that this entire movement was started by people who were saying Black Lives Matter. There was a state-sponsored execution of a movement leader, and people said that is absolutely unacceptable. And for the last 2,000 plus years, we have been saying that we reject state-sponsored execution of minority, of poor, of marginalized people, and that's what we're supposed to be up to. And people forget that in the movement, and they make it spiritualized, they make it about the covenant of the table, and they make it about autonomy. It's all hypocrisy if you don't claim where the thing started. You've lost the foundation of where it started, right?
And historically, a lot of the missionary movement was, we'll save your souls and exploit you and kill you.
Yeah, well.
Doctrine of
There's
discovery.
a real problem with that picture, isn't there?
Yes.
So this is how narrative and structures align, like the doctrine of discovery, the notion that what we've got here is good and what's out there is not good. And so we can take what they have in terms of material goods and acquire it for ourselves because we have a better notion of how to do good on God's behalf. And so colonialism can be theologically supported. Genocide and dispossession of land and enslavement can all be culturally supported by the notion that there is this narrative that says that we have a better system, a better way. We have access to civilization and others do not.
Well, and I think that, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Judith.
I think that narrative is like in our churches still, of like people who go to church are good, people who don't go to church are bad. And we've forgotten about the confession of sins, that we are all sinners, that we're connected. I don't know, I just like really struggle with that narrative that we all have, like that seems to be in the air we breathe at church. And I don't know how to like go against it or to bring up that counter narrative that's going to church doesn't make us good.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's this other piece, though. There's this other piece that I love about the disciples. It's not just if you go to church, you're not good. It's that if you aren't celebrating the covenant, if you aren't celebrating the Eucharist every week, every time you're in church, you may not be not good, but you're deficient in your practice, right? And so there's a level of deficiency and hierarchy that gets established and embedded inside of the narrative. So there's this superiority. So you would expect that the denomination would remain small because it's really at the top of the food chain among those who practice the faith, right?
Wow.
Well,
That's it.
Archie.
That's it. That's it. Ouch.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm looking at time. We're almost up, aren't we? Thank you
We
so much.
are.